On behalf of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, we welcome you to the UW Center for Civic Engagement and the James F. Veninga Theater for tonight's event, which is The Impact of Big Money on Politics, featuring Jay Heck, as you know. My name is John Visti. I'm the program manager for WIPPS. I'll tell you to turn off your phones in a minute. So we would like to thank our partner in this effort, the American Association of University Women, for their untiring work and support in helping organize this program. In particular, I would like to give my personal thanks to Mary Jarvis and Mary Ann Segrin Hall, who have been fantastic in doing this and have a lot more energy than I do. WIPPS was founded in 2007 as a unit of the UW Colleges and UW Extension. Our mission is to address local, state, and national issues by linking public scholarship, civic outreach, and student service to enhance community life throughout Wisconsin. Our work is based on two core ideas. We support citizen-centered democracy, and we embrace the Wisconsin idea. Which is still there. They haven't taken it out yet. So we believe that the strength of American democracy in the 21st century depends on the engagement of citizens and communities in making decisions about issues that matter to them. We promote and build capacity for work by the public for public purposes. As part of the University of Wisconsin, we recognize the Wisconsin idea as more than a platitude. The Wisconsin idea holds that the resources of the university should be used to serve the interests and the needs of the entire state. To this end, WIPPS's task is to provide resources, information, and ideas to empower the people and communities of Wisconsin. Tonight's forum would not have been possible without the work of the staff here at WIPPS and UWMC. These include, but are not limited to, the director of WIPPS, Mr. Eric Giordano, program associate Connie Nicolai, communications coordinator Deb Dorhorst, state development coordinator Mandy Wright, IT coordinator Justin Bellick, theater technician Chris Berg, hey Chris, and research assistants Matt Fromm and Leo Moore. We would like to thank Dean Montgomery of the UW Marathon County for the campus's ongoing support of WIPPS's mission. Following the speaker, we will have an audience question and answer session. We will circulate throughout the theater with microphones. One question per person, please, and be sure to speak into the microphone as we are recording this event. We ask that you accord our guests and each other the courtesy and respect that we all expect from a public forum dedicated to civil dialogue. At this time, please check to make sure that your cell phones and electronic devices are silenced. Our forum will end promptly at 8 o'clock, and but I'm sure there will be time to talk to the speaker afterwards if you so desire. Finally, beginning in July 1st, 2016, WIPPS will no longer receive any public funding and will be entirely self-sustaining. This is not due to the recent budget cuts. This was in effect before. If you have appreciated our programming in the past or you find tonight's program stimulating, we would encourage you to donate to WIPPS. Please there's a table at the back, and if you want to make a tax-deductible contribution, we would most appreciate it. Mandy Wright is not only our newly appointed State Development Coordinator, she is also an active member in the American Association of University Women, our partner in this event, and a good friend of Jay Heck's. Therefore, it is most appropriate that Mandy introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much for coming tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce my friend, Jay Heck. Jay Heck became the executive director of Common Cause in Wisconsin in 1996 and was hired by former Wisconsin Governor Tony Earl, a Democrat, former state representative May-Lou Muntz, also a Democrat, and by Bill Krause, a former Republican strategist and top advisor to Republican governors Lee Sherman Dreyfus and Warren Knowles. Heck moved to Wisconsin in 1988 from Washington, D.C. to serve as a top assistant to the Wisconsin State Majority Leader at the time, Joseph Stroll. He is a native of Cleveland, Ohio, and graduated with honors from Miami University and Oxford, Ohio. He resides in Madison, has a son, Gabriel, who is a senior at Cornell University, and a daughter, Emily, who is a freshwoman at Oberlin College. Under Jay's leadership, Common Cause led the successful legislative effort to enact into law Wisconsin's Lobbyist Online legislation, which requires lobbyists to report activity with 15 days, within 15 days, the most stringent such law in the nation. The 2007 law requiring paper ballots to accompany optical scan voting in the state, the establishment of the Nonpartisan Government Accountability Board in 2007, which Common Cause of Wisconsin devised with legislators of both political parties, and also helped develop the Impartial Justice Law of 2009, which Common Cause Wisconsin developed with State Senator Pat Kreitlow and State Representative Mark Pocan. That bill provided full public financing to candidates for the Wisconsin Supreme Court who abided by spending limits of $400,000. Governor Scott Walker repealed this law in 2011. In 2013-14, Common Cause Wisconsin has led the effort to bring nonpartisan redistricting reform to Wisconsin. Common Cause Wisconsin also leads efforts to require electioneering disclosure of special interest dark money and is very active in opposing attempts to make it more difficult for Wisconsinites to vote. Common Cause in Wisconsin is the state's largest nonpartisan political reform advocacy organization with approximately 3,000 members and is affiliated with National Common Cause, which was founded in 1970 by the late John Gardner and is one of the nation's preeminent citizens lobbying organizations. It is with that I also want to remind you I have been circulating through the crowd to make sure everyone has one of these yellow sheets. If you do not, I will be walking past again. Just raise your hand and I will get you one because our presenter tonight, Jay Heck, will be referencing the information on that sheet. And so without any further ado, thank you very much for coming and welcoming our guest, Jay Heck.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming on what arguably might be the nicest night of the year so far. I know if I were home in Madison, I'd probably be outside with a beer, talking to neighbors. But I'm delighted to be here with you tonight. Wasau's always been one of my favorite places. As Mandy mentioned to you, I am originally from Ohio, from Cleveland, but I have been a Wisconsinite since 1988, and so I have spent more of my life in Wisconsin than any other single place, and I think I'm finally entitled to call myself a full-fledged Wisconsinite. I've also been to Wausau, at my last count, 14 times over the last 25 years, and I bet that's more than anybody in Madison other than somebody who's in office has ever been up here. So again, I'm very delighted. I wanted to just say one thing before we start, and that is that the way my mind thinks is chronologically. I'm a date person. I have my email organized by years rather than by subject matter. I was a history major, so that's how I think. And the reason I wanted Mandy to hand all of you this yellow sheet out tonight is that my talk is really kind of chronological. What I want to do is go through sort of the history of good government in Wisconsin and the evolution of money in the state so that you can see where we are now, how it has evolved over the years. Again, my chronology is really the way I organize everything. For instance, I can remember the first time I encountered Mandy Wright, and that was in January of 2013 when Mandy came before the Common Cause in Wisconsin State Governing Board at a meeting in the Capitol. I had never met her before, and she sat down and gave a stunning presentation about why Wisconsin needs to have nonpartisan redistricting reform. And that is an issue that is critically important, although most Wisconsinites don't really know much about it. Their eyes might even glaze over a bit when they hear nonpartisan redistricting reform uttered. And yet Mandy knew within 2 months of being elected to the state legislature how critical it was for Wisconsin and why it was so important as an issue to get a responsive legislature, to get a legislature that was elected in competitive elections, to give the voters of Wisconsin a real choice. And so Mandy, then as now, has been a real friend of mine and I think of all of political reform in Wisconsin. I want to just start out my talk by telling you, while you may love having her back here, we really miss her in Madison, and I hope she'll come back in some capacity soon. My talk starts in Cleveland, Ohio, in the turn of the century, the 20th century. At that time, this is 1898, there was an industrialist by the name of Mark Hanna. He was what I guess you would call a robber baron. And he bought himself a United States Senate seat. He single-handedly put William McKinley in the White House. He wanted to make sure that McKinley won, so he decided to make sure that the Republican Party at that time outspent the Democratic Party of William Jennings Bryan by a ratio of 7-to-1. And he picked that number because the big issue in 1896 was, believe it or not, the free coinage of silver versus the gold standard. It seems like a pretty archaic issue right now, but it was incredibly important back then because all the gold was held by the Eastern industrialists, the robber barons, and William Jennings Bryan and the populists, he was from Nebraska, wanted to coin silver so that that could be a form of money and cash payment that middle class and poor folk and farmers in particular would be able to use. And so, in fact, Mark Hanna and William McKinley did outspend Jennings Bryan and won the presidency in 1896. And Mark Hanna was known for one thing in all of his years in political life and in the presidency, and that was this saying. He said, there are two important things in American politics. The first is money, and I've forgotten what the second is. It's a true quote. And it's as true now as it was back in 1896. Money, although it's always been with us, was incredibly important back then, and today it's just as important, if not more. But because of William McKinley and because of that spending in 1896 and 1900, and because McKinley was followed by a fellow by the name of Teddy Roosevelt and Senator Robert F. La Follette of the state of Wisconsin, an era of reform was ushered into the state shortly after Teddy Roosevelt became president. And for over 100 years, by and large, elections in the United States and in Wisconsin were not controlled by money. They were really controlled by ideas, issues, sections of the country people came from, prejudices, issues, things that people favored. Money was always an issue, but the Congress in 1905 and here in Wisconsin established a real good set of rules so that money would be kept at bay and not completely dominate the elections of the 20th century. The system worked pretty well, although, as any system, needs fixing over the years. You'll recall, I certainly do, the Watergate scandal of 1972, 1973. That was about crooks hired by President Nixon's reelection committee, called the Committee to Reelect the President, CREEP was the acronym, who broke into the Watergate Hotel, where the Democratic National Committee was headquartered, to steal secrets and papers. But the real scandal was the money that financed it. The burglars were funded by secret money, slush funds, huge bags of cash that were given by wealthy individuals to the CREEP, the Committee to Reelect the President, and that money was utilized to undertake many various activities, such as the burglary. And as you know, Richard Nixon was driven from office, and an era of reform, again, was ushered in to the United States. We set up a public financing system for the presidency, which worked very well from 1976 to about 2000, 2004. Then it began to fall apart, and it's now gone. It's already been eliminated by the Congress. It also ushered in reforms across the country. And in Wisconsin, it led to the creation in this state, being one of the first states to do so, create a system called public financing of elections. And what public financing is based on, and what it does, is it says that, again, we think elections ought not to be decided on the amount of money that's spent. Ideas should prevail. And so to try to make that work and not have the corrupting influence of money once again creep into the politics as it did in the 1890s during the Gilded Age, we're going to set up a system by which if a candidate voluntarily, and they have to voluntarily do so, agrees to limit their spending in an election, they would be eligible for partial or full public financing. That would be money from either the taxpayers or another source, and that way elections would be roughly equal in terms of spending. And then ideas, rather than the amount of money, would be allowed to prevail. And so Wisconsin, in 1977, set up such a system, which was really one of the first systems in the country. It was a partial public financing system whereby if you agreed to limit your spending, if you were running for the state assembly, to about $15,000, you would get half of that, or 45% actually, but nearly half of that, about $7,000 in public money, and then you would have to raise the other yourself, but you couldn't spend more than $15,000. Same was true for the state senate. The limit was double, it was about $30,000. And for governor, the amount of money, the spending limit was $1,078,000. I'm not sure why that was the number that was chosen, but that was the amount that you could get. And if you agreed to that spending limit, you'd get about $450,000 in public financing. And it worked very well. It was a system that was in place for about 10 years, and in the Wisconsin legislature, Republicans and Democrats both participated in it. Many folks were elected under that system, and it was a great system because candidates for office weren't fundraising all the time, and more importantly, the source of their money wasn't from wealthy special interest groups, and they weren't beholden to anybody when they came to Madison. They were able to make decisions actually based on the merits, not based on the donors who were supplying the money to get them elected. And as I say, it was a system that really brought a lot of cooperation during the late 1970s and 1980s in Wisconsin. And a lot of great things were accomplished. But that changed in the mid-1980s. First of all, one of my personal political mentors, who actually hired me at Common Cause, and of course a a great former resident of Wausau, Governor Tony Earl, was governor from 1983 to 87. And in 1986, which was a pretty good Democratic year around the rest of the country, Tony ran against a guy by the name of Tommy Thompson. And that election, total spending in that gubernatorial election by both candidates and by any outside groups totaled less than $3 million. Less than $3 for both of them. And that was an election that was really decided on issues. Thompson won in large part because Governor Earl wanted to and fiercely believed that it was necessary to site a prison in Milwaukee County, because many of the people who went to prison were from Milwaukee County, and he thought that would be a good place to have a prison so that they could be visited by their families a little bit more easily, and for a number of other reasons. But the mayor of Milwaukee, a guy by the name of Henry Mayer, Bud Selig, who owned the Milwaukee Brewers, and a whole host of other folks in Milwaukee, a lot of them Democrats, didn't like that idea. They didn't want a prison in Milwaukee County. They liked having the idea that prisons were in places like Portage or northern Wisconsin or Oxford or Waupun or something else. And that's one of the reasons Earl got defeated. It was issues. It wasn't money. And Tommy Thompson, to his credit, abided by the spending limits that year, as did Governor Earl. And that was really the last election in Wisconsin that was really decided solely on issues and not money. Because Thompson realized that if he decided not to accept public financing and not abide by spending limits, he could raise a lot of money as governor. And so when he ran for re-election in 1990, he didn't abide by the spending limit of $1 million. He raised $5 million. And he crushed Tom Loftus, who at that time was the Democratic Assembly Speaker. And that was the time, too, when we began to see in Wisconsin outside groups begin to get involved in our elections. Elections used to be local affairs. They used to be decided in Wausau, largely by money that was raised in Wausau. There might have been some money from around the state, but not a lot. But most legislators depended on their own home areas for the campaign funds that they raised. And then, of course, when we had public financing, they were able to get some of their funds from the public fund and not have to raise as much money from individual donors. And there wasn't a lot of outside interference. Back in those days, the way outside groups got involved in politics was they would go door to door. I can remember as a kid growing up, somebody from the Chamber of Commerce or the Democratic Club, or I lived in a very Republican neighborhood, the Republican Club, people would come to the house and they would knock on the door and they'd say, "We urge you to vote for this person." They'd hand you a brochure. And that's how the word was spread by outside organizations. Well, when the teachers union, WIAC, the Wisconsin Education Association Council, saw that Thompson was not going to abide by spending limits anymore, they decided to step up in a big way to begin to help Democratic candidates. And this is 1990. And so they began running these outside ads. They're called independent expenditures, where they would not be joined or they would not be connected to the campaign of a Democratic office holder, but they would run independent expenditures. There couldn't be coordination. There couldn't be collusion between the outside groups and the candidates. But in this way, they were able to help elect or try to defeat Republican candidates because they were able to spend money outside of what the candidate themselves were spending. And it wasn't long before the state's largest business group decided to counter that, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. And they decided to do it in a slightly different way. They didn't want to have their donors disclosed, so they developed something called issue ads, or what I call phony issue ads, where the types of ads they ran were not vote for Mandy Wright or defeat Mandy Wright or vote for was his name John Heaton, Rick Heaton, I don't even know what his name is, Dave Heaton. Instead, the issue ads, or the phony issue ads as we call them, would say something like, Mandy Wright's very liberal, she wants to raise your taxes, and she's bad for your children. Call Mandy Wright and tell her not to do that. Now, that's the kind of communication that has the same effect as vote for Mandy Wright or defeat Mandy Wright. But because they didn't use, those outside communications don't use what we call magic words. They didn't say vote for, vote against, defeat, support. They were exempt from registration and disclosure. They're called issue ads. And so WMC decided to utilize that tool because in that way they could collect money, unlimited money, by the way, from millionaires, from people not just in Wisconsin, but all over the country, and not have to disclose who their donors were. And so by 1996, that was really what our elections were fast evolving into. There would be the candidate elections, but then there would also be the outside elections. And really more money began to be spent by these outside groups than the candidates themselves. And the problem with that is that those outside groups began to set the agenda. The other thing that happened, remember I'm chronological, was roughly the time I began as the director of Common Cause, late 1995, 96. Two individuals became the head of their respective parties in the legislature, the majority party. The Democrats were headed by State Senator Chuck Chvala, who was someone I had known for many years, a liberal Democrat from Madison. He was kind of a common cause type of a Democrat. He was a reformer. He was for public financing. He was for campaign finance reform. He was for good ethics laws. But he became the head of the Senate Democrats. At the same time, a fellow by the name of Scott Jensen became the leader of the Republicans in the Assembly. And we're going to come back to Scott Jensen at the end of this story because he's still very much a part of the political fabric in Wisconsin, as you in Wausau should know very well, and certainly Mandy Wright does. But they became the leaders. And the problem with that was that neither of them were really inclined to work in a bipartisan fashion with each other. In fact, Scott Jensen, one of the first things he told Republicans when they were elected to the Assembly is, I don't want to see you having a lunch with any Democrats. We don't want to see you socializing with Democrats. And as Dave Obey can tell you, and as Dave Obey now travels around northern Wisconsin with Tom Petri, that's where bipartisanship and cooperation is key. That's where you establish personal relationships with people in the other party. That's where you come together to serve your constituents rather than your partisan masters. But Jensen wanted no part of that. He was a disciple of Newt Gingrich. Remember Newt Gingrich? And believed very strongly in what Newt Gingrich did in really blowing up the U.S. House of Representatives and making sure that everybody hated everybody on the other side. And Scott Jensen, who had been an assistant to chief of staff, actually, to Governor Walker, believed that was the way the Republicans could stay in power. They were elected, by the way, and took over the Assembly in 1994, the same year Gingrich and the Republicans took over the Congress. But Chuck Chvala also decided that he needed to play hardball, and so he decided that he was going to be very harsh as well and very, very partisan. He justified it by saying, if we don't do this, then all will be lost. I disagreed with him then. A number of other Republicans and Democrats disagreed with him. It's not the Wisconsin way. We felt the way to win, the way to prevail over the Scott Jensens of the world was to do what Bob LaFollette did and raise the specter of reform and raise the specter of clean government and appeal to people's better instincts, not to their base instincts. But nevertheless, the system evolved with these two very partisan leaders leading their respective chambers in the legislature throughout the rest of the 1990s. The big test really was in 1995 and 96, when a Republican state senator, who actually had defeated my former boss, Democratic State Senator Joe Stroll, a Republican senator by the name of George Petak, decided to change his vote in the middle of the night and vote for county taxing to build Miller Park after he'd promised his constituents he wouldn't. And a recall was instituted by his constituents in Racine, and he lost the election, and control of the state Senate swung to the Democrats. And so you had a Democratic state Senate and a Republican Assembly and a Republican governor. Again, they had to work with each other when they could, but it was fraying, and you could see that it was fraying. And the politics in the state became increasingly ugly, and the money being spent in these elections was increasingly ugly. And that continued in 1997 in a Supreme Court race in Wisconsin. That year, Justice Wilcox, John Wilcox, who was a conservative, was up for re-election. He ran against a Milwaukee judge by the name of Walt Kelly. And Wilcox vastly outspent Wilcox, in part because his campaign was coordinating illegally with an outside group that was pouring lots of money to defame Walt Kelly and to go after Kelly and support John Wilcox. And why that's significant, and we'll return to it at the end of the story, is that in Wisconsin, it's illegal for an outside group to coordinate their campaign activities with the candidate's campaign. And it's easy to see why, because contribution limits would mean nothing. If you could give a candidate for the assembly $500, but then could work with their campaign and supply another $50,000 for outside spending, well, that's really a $50,500 contribution to the candidate, isn't it? Because you're coordinating your activities with the candidate's campaign, and therefore that $500 is just window dressing, because you're supplying basically all that money for that candidate. And that's what Justice Wilcox was found guilty of doing, violating Wisconsin law, which says you cannot coordinate with outside spending groups. That's at the heart of a scandal that we are in the midst of today, and we'll come back to that. The reason I'm doing this chronologically is I want you to see how this developed over time. This wasn't, a coup d'etat. This wasn't some insidious thing that happened overnight. This took time. 1998 was an incredible year for campaign finance reform in so many ways. In 1998, a Democratic state senator from Waukesha, believe it or not, for 20 years, Waukesha County had a Democratic state senator. It's hard to believe today. His name was Lynn Edelman, and he was a fiery progressive. He didn't compromise at all. He was sort of the least likely person that you would think of to represent Waukesha County. But he always got reelected because he always did very well for his constituents, and he always knocked on doors, and he did everything a candidate should do, and people liked him on principle. But he was appointed to a federal judgeship by President Clinton. Tommy Thompson, Governor Thompson, was more than happy to recommend him, because Thompson knew that if Lynn Edelman were appointed to the federal bench, that there would be a special election in Waukesha. And there was a pretty good chance that it would be a Republican who would be elected, and control of the state Senate would then revert to the Republicans. And that's exactly what happened. Mary Lozick was elected state senator, and it was the most expensive election at that time in Wisconsin for a state Senate or state or assembly seat. It was about $450,000. And people were shocked. That was considered a huge amount of money as recently as 1998. And a Republican governor, Tommy Thompson, called the Wisconsin legislature, which was now controlled totally by Republicans, into special session, believe it or not, on campaign finance reform. It was incredible because back then, Republicans, and many of them, believed we needed public financing. They believed we needed disclosure. Many of them didn't like the fact that money was calling the shots. Many of them didn't like the fact that WMC, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, and a lot of these conservative groups would spend all this money during the election and then come in to tell them what they wanted on the legislative agenda. There were a lot of Republicans who really resented that. One that I began working very closely with, who at that time was the Republican majority leader of the Senate, a guy by the name of Mike Ellis, who was from Neenah. And Ellis was fiercely proud and fiercely independent. He hated it when these right-wing groups came in and told him what to do. He said, that's not how we're going to do things. And so he was very much in favor of trying to get the genie back in the bottle. And so Ellis in the Senate, Scott Jensen, who he didn't have any interest in campaign finance reform, in the Assembly, and Thompson called the special session. And there were proposals to bring back public financing, to bring back disclosure. And Jensen put the campaign finance reform package in the hands of a young state representative from the Milwaukee area who was the chair of the Campaigns and Elections Committee, a young guy by the name of Scott Walker. And Walker, not surprisingly, I would go in to see him, talk to him, very polite, but he had his own agenda. And it was Walker who really scuttled the special session on campaign finance reform. He put forth a proposal, a counter-proposal to Senator Ellis, and negotiations broke off, and the session was ended without any progress. But it was really Walker, because Walker believed that money was a good thing, special interest money was a great thing, that it was okay for very wealthy individuals and outside groups to spend a lot of money, that public financing was welfare for politicians, as he called it. Spending limits were ridiculous. It was free speech, all the things that you hear today about why they don't believe in limitations on money was being spouted back then by a very young and ambitious Republican state representative from Wauwatosa. Tommy Thompson supported public financing. Many members of the state Senate and many members of the Assembly did. Walter John Shilson, prior to his defeat in 1990, was a strong supporter of public financing. A great many Republicans were around the state. But Scott Jensen and Republicans that came after him began to turn their party against things like public financing, disclosure, trying to have spending limits, those types of things. Nevertheless, Ellis worked very strongly and with a sizable bunch of Republicans, mainly in the state Senate, to come together with Democrats and try to, again, bring integrity back to Wisconsin elections. In 2001, I worked very closely with Senator Judy Robson, who was a Democrat from Beloit, and a number of Republicans to try to get disclosure of these outside groups. We came within one vote in the state assembly, one vote. We passed overwhelmingly in the state Senate, but one vote in the state assembly. Had we gotten that, we would know today who those groups are behind WMC or the Greater Wisconsin Committee and all these other groups with names like the Federation for Children, the American Federation for Children, or my favorite, All Children Matter, or all of these groups. They all have crazy names like, We Love Wisconsin, or you name it. It's none of them disclose where their money came from. So 2001 we came close, and then that year and then the next were really dramatic. And if any of you remember, Wisconsin was embroiled in something called the Legislative Caucus Scandal. And what it was all about illegal fundraising being done in the Capitol by the top legislative leaders, Democratic and Republican. And it was all about extortion. It was about holding bills up to get scheduled on the floor of the state Senate or the state Assembly for a price, for a contribution. And it became endemic because both sides were engaged in it. And for a year, it paralyzed Wisconsin. It's all that was in the press was the investigation. It was what was called a John Doe investigation. And the John Doe investigation was conducted by the Democratic District Attorney, Brian Blanchard in Dane County, because that's where most of the illegal activity took place. And it used to be in Wisconsin, even if you were a legislator, it still is for you, by the way. If you commit a crime, if you get a speeding ticket, in Marathon County, that's where you will be tried, or a crime. But, and back then, it was in Madison. The Milwaukee County District Attorney stepped in because Blanchard had to recuse himself from prosecuting Chuck Qualla, because Qualla, as the Democratic leader, his staff had helped Blanchard get nominating signatures when he ran for district attorney in Dane County. So E. Michael McCann, a Democrat from Milwaukee County, prosecuted Qualla. Brett Blanchard prosecuted Scott Jensen. And Brian Burke, who was a Democratic senator from Milwaukee, the chair of the Joint Finance Committee. And in June and October of 2002, Wisconsin had something happen that's never happened anywhere else in the country. Not in Illinois, not in New Jersey, not in New York, not in states that you might expect to see that kind of thing happening. We had criminal felony chargings of the top legislative leaders of both chambers of the legislature, of both political parties, 5 within a period of 4 months. And most of them happened in October of 2002, right before the election. And as you may know, all of those people eventually were forced from office. All of them were convicted, and many of them, 3 of them, spent time in prison. Scott Jensen was convicted of 3 felony counts in Dane County, but because of faulty jury instructions given to the jury by the judge, it was declared a mistrial. He appealed the case and then had his venue moved to Waukesha County, where the current Attorney General of Wisconsin, Brad Schimmel, did a plea deal with Jensen and basically just left him with a misdemeanor and a civil forfeiture, and he spent no time in jail. But that was the caucus scandal, and there was great hope that the caucus scandal would spur reform again, because it was all about money in politics. It was all about having outside groups contribute. These were the legislative leaders, Qualla in particular, by the way, who was directing outside groups to give money to certain entities that could be used to elect candidates to public office on the Democratic side. Jensen, as Republicans do, delegated it a little bit better. He wasn't quite the control freak Qualla was, and he delegated it to other folks to do, although he obviously oversaw the operation. Jim Doyle, remember him? He's governor. He ran on a platform to clean up Wisconsin politics. He ran against the legislative leadership, including Qualla, but Jensen also, and promised campaign finance reform. He promised that he would, as governor, enact Ellis-Erpenbach, which was a bipartisan campaign finance, a comprehensive campaign finance reform bill that we worked very closely with those senators on, to establish spending limits and public financing again in Wisconsin. And he said that this was going to be a top priority. Unfortunately, when Governor Doyle became Governor Doyle, he realized that it's pretty easy to raise money when you're governor. This happens to a lot of folks. When they're in power, sometimes it's easier to get money than when you're out of power and trying to raise money. And Doyle also saw that the Ellis-Erpenbach bill had a spending limit of $4 million for governor. And he was going to run for re-election by the time this bill came up in 2006. He wasn't sure he wanted to be limited to just $4 million. So he worked against the bill. And a number of other Democrats turned on the bill. And of course, a number of the Republicans, the most conservative, in fact, turned on the bill. And we had a bipartisan group of folks who were very strongly in favor of campaign finance reform, but they were deserted. And we didn't have it. It was the last great opportunity we had in Wisconsin to get our elections back under control and in your hands, not in the hands of outside special interest groups. And it was a tragedy, in my view. And I think it's something, actually, that Governor Doyle may regret. I know a lot of people, particularly on the Democratic side, really regret that he didn't take advantage of the bully pulpit and make that a central issue, because he could have. So we went through the rest of the 2000s. But in 2007, we finally did get one reform that Senator Ellis, by the way, and Senator Erpenbach, Common Cause, a couple other folks had put together, and that was to take elections out of the hands of the partisan state elections board and the ethics board, who, by the way, did nothing to stop the legislative caucus scandal because they were partisan. So all the Democrats and all the Republicans would vote with their party rather than vote on what was right for the election law. And so neither of them were interested in investigating the caucus scandal because Democrats and Republicans were both involved. It was a bipartisan scandal. And so they did nothing. And so we decided Wisconsin needed to be the first state in the country, and we were, to establish an entity that oversaw our elections, our ethics, our campaign finance laws that wasn't controlled by Republicans or Democrats. It was independent. And instead of having Republican appointments by the governor, the Senate Majority Leader, or the political party chieftains, instead we had 6 appointed retired judges who would be making the decisions that came before it with regard to elections, campaign finance, and ethics. And it was established with virtually unanimous support in 2007 in the special session of the legislature. And it's worked magnificently. And why do I say that? Because the people, because both Republicans and Democrats have complained about it. That's exactly what they're supposed to do. They're not supposed to be pleased with what the Government Accountability does, because the Government Accountability Board is supposed to be responsible to you, and not to the partisan folks in the legislature or the special interest groups. And the Government Accountability Board faced a whole host of challenges, but these 6 retired judges who were above partisan politics acted with great integrity, and they angered, as I say, both sides. One of the key components that we invested in the Government Accountability Board was the independent ability to investigate political corruption. And that was key, because that's what we needed to have during the caucus scandal. The legislature appropriates all state agencies, including the old state elections board. So if the state elections board decided, even if they'd wanted to investigate corruption, the legislative leaders, who were the ones under investigation, would have pulled the money for it. So it was important to have an independent stream of funding for the Government Accountability Board. And as you know, or you don't know, but we'll talk about that shortly, that's one of the government agencies that's being slated to be destroyed this year by the majority in the Wisconsin legislature, despite the fact that every Republican who was in the legislature in 2007 voted for it. How quickly they forgot. But that doesn't seem to create a lot of shame with a lot of folks. The other thing as we go on through this list, and it's not all bad news, but you have to get through the bad news first. In 2007, that same year, we had what I call the first of the really ugly Supreme Court elections in this state, where outside groups played a predominant role in electing our Supreme Court justice. In Wisconsin for many years, candidates for the state Supreme Court you couldn't tell what party they were. They were ideologically sort of neutral. And people became elected as a Supreme Court justice based on their credentials, their judicial temperament, by the number of state bar, not tavern league bars, but legal bars that endorsed them around the state. And that was the case. You don't want a judge who's a partisan. You obviously want an impartial judge before you. But in 2007, that changed because the outside groups, particularly Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, decided that it's a lot easier to buy a Supreme Court than it is to buy a legislature. A little bit cheaper, too, although they decided to spend quite a bit of money anyway. And so they poured in hundreds of thousands of dollars to make sure that the candidate they wanted elected, to replace, by the way, Justice Wilcox from 10 years previous, was a conservative. And so Annette Ziegler was elected in 2007 in a close election, but in large part because she and the outside money vastly outspent the candidate, Linda Clifford, that ran against her. And then that scenario was repeated the following year in a particularly ugly race when Justice Louis Butler of Milwaukee, an African American, was on the court, and a guy by the name of Michael Gableman, who was from the north, up north, I think it's Ashland, was put up by the conservatives to run against him. And what was really a despicable race tried to portray Justice Gableman as being soft on crime with ads that portrayed an African American from Milwaukee who had been incarcerated for a particularly heinous crime, had gotten out of jail and then committed a crime. They're very reminiscent, by the way, of the Willie Horton ads that ran in the late 1980s against Michael Dukakis in the president's race. And it was particularly despicable because those types of issues have no place in a Supreme Court race. The Supreme Court's an appellate court. They don't deal with issues of crime. It's not a case of a judge being soft on crime. But it was to try to create the impression through inference and race that Louis Butler, because he was from Milwaukee, another code word, and was African American, would somehow not be suitable to be reelected, and appealed to people's base instincts. And again, that was a race that a lot of outside money, most of it on the far right, came in and put a Supreme Court justice into place. 2009, there was some good news. 2009, finally there was a very good campaign finance reform bill that was enacted into law to take the money out of the Supreme Court races. People were pretty disgusted by that Gableman-Butler race in 2008. And so in 2009, there was a law passed in the Wisconsin legislature. It was by and large, though not bipartisan. There was some Republican support, particularly in the state Senate, for it, but not as much in the Assembly. But it established full public financing for candidates for the Wisconsin Supreme Court who agreed to abide by $400,000 spending limit. And that was key because the last thing you want is a Supreme Court justice accepting contributions from trial lawyers, sorry if there are trial lawyers here, or business people, or any other entity if they have to decide a case, because that would create a conflict of interest in some ways, where it would be proper for the justice to recuse themselves. But if all the money that's funding their campaign is public money, then you don't have that issue. because the candidate or the justice is not going to have any conflict of interest because there's no special interest money coming before the court. Instead, the money is public. And the great thing about public financing, by the way, if anybody ever tries to argue with you, is that it makes candidates beholden to the public at large. They're not beholden to some special interest group who has a narrow agenda. Public financing makes you beholden to the public. So the public good is what you're looking out for, not some special interest good. And so that reform was really pretty significant. It was, in fact, the most significant reform in Wisconsin, arguably since public financing in the 1970s, although the Government Accountability Board was a pretty good one. But beyond that, it was unprecedented in the nation. And we were for a brief period of time, we were a national model for judicial elections. And it was wonderful. But then the following year, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this, there was a pretty big decision handed down by one vote, a 5-4 decision, the United States Supreme Court called the Citizens United decision. And for those of you that don't know really what it does, essentially what it did was it erased 100 years of law, of settled law, which barred corporations and outside organizations from being able to use their general treasury money to influence federal and state elections. Federal Tillman Act, the reforms of Bob La Follette, and others here in Wisconsin. So these outside corporations couldn't use their money. They had to set up what's called a political action committee, which is disclosed regulated money, or they could run these phony issue ads. But we had hopes of being able to get those disclosed. But Citizens United wiped that all away. So it made it possible for these outside groups to spend unlimited money in our elections. The United States Supreme Court in that decision, while they opened the floodgates, also by an 8-1 decision, only Justice Clarence Thomas, the justice who never speaks, voted against it. But the other, 4 of the conservatives joined the 4 less conservative U.S. Supreme Court justices and said, by the way, we're unleashing this money, but if you were wise, Congress, and if you were wise states, you would enact disclosure laws so at least the citizens of your state know where the hell the money's coming from that's about to be dropped on them like a bomb. And you'll at least be able to make some kind of judgment about the candidates who are up for election about where that money's coming from and how it influences your vote. And so a number of states did move to require disclosure of those outside ads. I was horrified to learn very shortly after the decision that Illinois, of all places, enacted disclosure of outside spending. And when Illinois does anything with regard to campaign finance reform or ending corruption, you know you're behind the 8 ball if they've done it before you have. And in fact, we tried here in Wisconsin again. And we tried, I'm sorry to say, when the Democrats had control of both houses of the legislature and the governorship. The problem was that arrogance of power. When you're in power, you often think, well, the rules as they are have helped to put me where I am, so why would I want to change the rules? The thinking was, amongst some, why would I want to require outside spending and disclosure if we're top dog right now? That might be offensive to some of the folks that support us. And so unfortunately, in 2009 and 2010, when they had control, the Democrats did not enact disclosure. They could have. There would have been Republican support for it, particularly in the state Senate, but they didn't, and it was a tragedy. A couple other things they didn't do, like redistricting reform and some other things, but we can talk about that later. I might add parenthetically, and I'm sure you would all be of interest, this is of interest to all of you, your own state senator, Russ Decker, was defeated in 2010 in part by a dump of $500,000 of outside undisclosed money at the end of the election. It might have been a little different story, I'm not saying it would have necessarily changed the outcome of the election, because 2010 was certainly a Republican tsunami, but it might have changed a little bit, at least had the money, had people had known where that money was coming from at the end. But it was that failure to come to an agreement by the Assembly Democrats and the Senate Republican Democrats that resulted in the fact that we still have no disclosure, because certainly when the Republicans seized power, they wanted none of it. By then, the Republican Party in this state has moved away from disclosure. They're moving away from all of the good reforms, the bipartisan reforms that they supported. And people like Senator Ellis, Mike Ellis, they're out of the legislature. Ellis, ironically, left last year. He was really forced from office because he went to a bar in Madison, had a few too many drinks, and was talking to what he thought were constituents from his, were actually from a right-wing outside group who wanted to go after Ellis because he wasn't in 100% lockstep with Governor Walker on some issues. And they trapped Ellis into talking about how Ellis was going to set up an outside group, which is illegal under Wisconsin law. It was Ellis really talking through, I think, a couple of brandy Manhattans. But he was saying that here's what I could do. He never did it, but he was saying I could do this. I could set this outside group up. And it was ironic because this is the kind of stuff that Ellis had been advocating against for years and years. But this right-wing group took the video that they took of him on a cell phone. By the way, these things are, watch it. If you're in public, you can make sure there's no cauliflower hanging out of your teeth, because they'll catch it on this. But so that was used against Ellis by a right-wing hit group who really preferred that there not be, they would love to have illegal coordination, but it knocked Ellis out of the race so that they could get a more conservative Republican to run in his place. So, that's kind of where it was back then. Just to finish the thought as we go through here, 2011 saw a lot of things happening, as you know. There was the Supreme Court race between David Prosser and Joanne Kloppenburg, which was very close, as you know. It really essentially became a referendum on Act 10 and what was happening in Madison, which is unfair because that's not how a Supreme Court race ought to be conducted. It ought to be conducted on who's better at being a Supreme Court justice. But it was a remarkable race in this respect. Neither Prosser nor Kloppenburg took any private money. They both abided by spending limits of $400,000. They both received $400,000, and that's all they spent, public financing. The problem was that the Citizens United decision and a subsequent U.S. Supreme Court decision knocked out a very important provision of the Impartial Justice Act, which would have provided additional public money to candidates if they were assaulted by these outside groups. The idea was that it's fine for you to abide by spending limits and take public financing, but what about these outside groups who could pour money in and attack you? And the Impartial Justice Bill provided for extra public financing so that you would be able to at least have something to defend yourself against these outside groups. That, unfortunately, was before the U.S. Supreme Court in 2011, so that part of the equation didn't kick in during the Prosser-Kloppenburg race. And it was a very close election, but the spending far favored Prosser, the conservative candidate, again by Wisconsin Club for Growth, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce. Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce and Wisconsin Club for Growth put in something like $6 or $7 million into 4 Wisconsin Supreme Court elections, including the most recent one last year between conservative Justice Pat Rogensack and her challenger Ed Falone, who is a Marquette University law professor, eminently qualified. But they put a lot of outside money in to protect Rogensack. And so our Supreme Court elections have become as filthy as our legislative and statewide elections for governor. Act 10, as you know, was about many things. Obviously, it was to curb the collective bargaining power of public employee unions. It was to reduce really the opportunities for teachers, public employees. It was to require that teachers and public employees pay more into their pension, or pay into their pension, more into their pension system, as well as more for their health care. And of course, it was very divisive. It was pitting Wisconsinite against Wisconsinite. But you know, that wasn't really the reason it was done. That was one of the reasons. But if you're looking for additional revenue, it all depends on what your priorities are and how you want to get the revenue. You don't have to take it out on the middle class. You don't necessarily have to go after teachers or pensions or healthcare costs. You could, for instance, raise the top rate in the state income tax. A number of other states have done that. I mean, if your goal is to balance the budget and you're seeking for revenues, that's a choice that you make. But this choice was particularly attractive to Walker and the Republicans, really for a very much more fundamental reason, which is almost never talked about. And that was to cripple the political power of the public employee unions. Remember, I talked about WIAC back in 1989. The teachers' union was a powerful political force in this state. They contributed large amounts of money. They were very supportive, usually of Democrats, not always. There were Republicans who they supported as well. But they were a powerful political force in the state. Arguably, that was a good thing because teachers had a pretty good position that way. They were sort of protected. But what the Republicans discovered was that if you can eliminate the source of funding, political money, that WIAC utilizes in elections, if you can require that instead of having if you can require a dues checkoff where anybody who becomes a teacher has to actively say, I want to contribute to the political action committee of the teachers union, rather than the system that had been set up where it's a negative checkoff. You don't have to contribute to the PAC, and Mandy could tell you this better than I. You don't have to contribute to the PAC if you don't choose to. You can tell them you don't want to. That's required by law. It's required by a Supreme Court decision many years ago, the Beck decision. But if you make it the other way, then the money that the democratic sources of money from the unions dries up. And AFSCME, American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, and the Wisconsin Education Association Council, two of the most powerful, politically powerful unions in the state, source of a lot of money in campaigns, they were eviscerated by Act 10. They're almost, I'm not going to say they're non-players in our elections, but they're certainly not, they certainly don't supply very much money, and they're not the big participants that they were. I think they're going to have to resort to being boots on the ground again and doing all the things that teachers do as well, and did anyway, which was organizing in their local communities. But that's really why. Because the purpose of Act 10 was much more about maintaining, and holding on to political power. And, there's an old saying, it's not enough to win, others must lose. And that's what Scott Walker had in mind. It wasn't enough for him to win the governorship and for the Republicans to gain control of both houses of the legislature. Others had to lose. The supporters, by and large, of Democratic candidates had to lose. And that way, they would maintain their political power for years to come. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that that's really what's behind Right to Work, too. It's really all about eviscerating the political power of the AFL-CIO, the carpenters, the building trades, all the non-governmental unions, so that they're not going to be potent at election time, so that Republicans will have the upper hand financially. Why that's troubling to a nonpartisan group like my own is because power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and if there is no check, if the political parties are not in rough parity and if they can't check each other, then the people in power lose sight of the fact that they have to be they have to be governing for all the people. This way they can govern just for their own people. And campaign finance reform has to be bipartisan. It's got to affect both political parties equally. It can't favor one party or favor the other party. But what's happened now is that with this money, we're now moving away from even the realization on the part of many Republicans that it's necessary to have any limits. They deny the basic fundamental tenet that you are beholden to people who help you financially. When you're 10 years old and you get a birthday card from Aunt Gladys, and she says, "Happy birthday," that's great. But when you get a birthday card from Aunt Agnes, and there's a $10 bill in it, my gosh, Aunt Agnes suddenly looks a little better, or maybe even a lot better than Aunt Gladys, because there's a $10 bill. That's human nature. You are beholden to people who give you things. The same is true in politics. You are beholden to people who help you financially with your campaign, or those outside groups who help you. And they deny that very tenet. They will always say there's no connection between the money and the policy. It's all about the money. It always has been, but it's even more so now because there's so much of it now, and the money can have such a tremendous influence. So that brings us to the near past. As you may know, in 2012, there was an investigation that was begun to investigate the recall, the 2012 recall campaign of Governor Scott Walker, which occurred in June of 2012. And the investigation, which we call in John Doe, is called a John Doe investigation. It's a secret investigation. It's supervised by a judge. It's similar to a grand jury investigation that you'll see in other states, but it's a bit more efficient. It's less expensive. And like most grand jury investigations, the John Doe is secret. It's even a little bit more secret. But it is an effective investigating tool. Without the John Doe investigation, for instance, we never would have uncovered the corruption in the Capitol during the caucus scandal. It never would have happened. And so shortly after the 2012 recall election, the Government Accountability Board, remember, 6 nonpartisan judges, voted unanimously to authorize a investigation of possible illegal coordination between Walker's recall campaign and outside groups that helped him during the recall, specifically Wisconsin Club for Growth, which spent something like $12 million, $10 to $12 million. We don't know exactly because it's that dark money, that outside money that doesn't require disclosure. Wisconsin manufacturers, some others. And so an investigation was launched, not by the Government Accountability Board, but by 2 Republican district attorneys, 3 Democratic district attorneys. The reason there were 5 district attorneys was that the various people that were being investigated were not all from the same county, and the activities that they were investigating didn't all take place in Dane County or in any one county. They took place in 5 counties. So there were 5 district attorneys, 2 Republican, 3 Democratic, and there was a Republican special prosecutor who said he had voted for Scott Walker, not only in the 2010 election, but during the recall election. And so these people were charged with looking into whether or not Walker's campaign had engaged in illegal coordination with these outside groups. That's against Wisconsin law. Remember Judge Wilcox I told you about back in 1997? He was fined, the most ever fined of an elected official in Wisconsin for illegal coordination in the 1997 campaign. So that was on the books in Wisconsin. So this investigation took off, but something very strange happened. Rather than the investigation being allowed to continue, there were a series of lawsuits by Wisconsin Club for Growth and others to stop the investigation. They violated the secrecy of the John Doe order, and they went to the Wall Street Journal in New York and said that this was an invasion of their First Amendment rights to be able to speak. It was against the law in Wisconsin, but they said that because the types of communications they ran, these phony issue ads, were not covered by disclosure law and therefore were technically, in the eyes of the United States Supreme Court and others, considered campaign ads, that there couldn't be campaign coordination between these outside groups with the Walker campaign. But in Wisconsin, even issue ad groups, if they coordinate with a campaign, that's illegal because that constitutes something of value to a candidate, right? Because if a candidate is in cahoots, in collusion with an outside group, that obviously gives them some idea about where they should spend their money, while the outside group can spend their money in other areas. So that coordination creates something of tremendous value to a candidate. The other thing is that it would, if we get rid of that law, or if that law is found unconstitutional, then contribution limits become meaningless. In Wisconsin, the most that you can give to a candidate for governor is $10,000. You can give $1,000 to a state senate candidate. You can give $500 to an assembly candidate. But if you can give $500, and Mandy, if it were true, this would be great. If you give $500 to Mandy Wright, and then you could go to some outside group and say, well, okay, I've given her the legal contribution limit of $500, but now I want to give you $100,000 because I want you to run ads supporting Mandy Wright. That $500 contribution limit becomes meaningless, right? Because you're actually giving $100,500 to support Mandy Wright. That's why it's illegal, that coordination. And so they have argued, and shockingly, a U.S. federal judge, a guy by the name of Rudolph Randa in Milwaukee, who, by the way, was going to retire in 2008, but he was so incensed by the fact that Barack Obama was elected president, he decided to stay on as a federal judge. He's very partisan. He was appointed by George W. Bush to the federal court, hardly impartial. But he stopped the investigation for that reason, because he bought the argument made by Wisconsin Club for Growth that this wasn't illegal campaign coordination, and therefore the basis of the investigation by the 5 district attorneys and the Republican special prosecutor had no basis. And so the investigation was halted. And it was then sent to the U.S. Court of Appeals in Chicago for the 7th Circuit. They laughed at Judge Randa's decision. They said, first of all, this is a state matter. You don't have a right to interject yourself into this decision. And so they turned down Judge Randa's. They ended his blocking of the investigation, but they said that the Wisconsin Supreme Court has to decide whether this investigation of Scott Walker will continue. Well, isn't that interesting? Wisconsin Club for Growth and Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, the 2 subjects of the investigation by the 5 district attorneys and the Republican special prosecutor, were the one for illegal coordination with the Walker recall campaign, had also provided all this outside assistance to 4 of our 7 state Supreme Court justices. So the Wisconsin Supreme Court is going to decide whether or not the investigation of Scott Walker's campaign ought to continue when they've been the recipient of the very people under investigation. In Wisconsin, we should, but we don't have recusal for things like that. I mean, it's an obvious conflict of interest. But by the way, the 4 conservatives who received all that money were the 4 in 2009 who voted against having to recuse themselves from a case because of a campaign contribution, let alone an outside source of help of running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So you're going to have the current Wisconsin Supreme Court, which is, as you know, 4-3 conservative, deciding the case of which 4 of those justices were the beneficiaries of the subject under investigation. Which takes me to two other things, and then we'll open this up. And I hope this isn't too technical for you. I just felt it was best to do it in sort of this way so that you can see how this has evolved and how everything's interconnected. And just let me take a sip here. The John Doe investigation that brought down the legislative leaders in the caucus scandal. Yesterday in Madison, just yesterday, there was, and today, by the way, it's advanced, there was legislation that my organization, one of my board members testified against. E. Michael McCann, who was the Milwaukee County prosecutor who prosecuted Qualla, is on the board, testified yesterday against a piece of legislation, and this is unbelievable in my view, that would weaken the John Doe investigatory process and basically make it impossible to investigate political corruption. I kid you not. The John Doe is used for a whole host of other crimes. It's used for, drug crimes, all kinds of all kinds of crimes that are committed, but it's very effective in the use of political corruption. But they've written the law in such a way that it would make it next to impossible to investigate political corruption charges. And it's on the fast track in the legislature. Now, why do you suppose that is? I'll tell you why. Because what they want to do is they want to make sure that they can get this through the legislature and signed into law by the governor before the Wisconsin Supreme Court has the opportunity to rule on whether or not that investigation of Walker's recall campaign should continue or not. Because if for some reason, I think it's largely unlikely, but not necessarily so, if for some reason the Wisconsin Supreme Court were to rule that the investigation could continue, well, if you've just stripped away the ability to conduct a John Doe investigation, then the investigation can't continue. It would have to start over. There'd have to be a convening of a grand jury or something else. Something else would have to go. This is a 2-year investigation. It would become moot. It would end, and that would be the end of it. Now, that's not the stated reason why. The stated reason why that they're doing this is they want to streamline the process. They don't think Wisconsin ought to have a John Doe when so many other states don't utilize the John Doe process. We shouldn't be the only ones to do it. They've even said that this is maybe unfair to some people who are being badgered by, who are drug dealers or, who have bought drugs, who are being butchered by, not butchered by, being bothered or burdened by a John Doe investigation. So they've tried to couch it in those terms as well. And they've also, of course, tried to make an issue that the John Doe investigation hasn't charged Governor Walker with anything, so they ought to just end it. So that's really what's behind it. It's like everything else. There's always a political reason behind almost any public policy thing that happens in Madison. It's all about the consolidation of political power. Obviously, they don't want anybody investigating them. They don't want corruption being investigated while they're in power. And to that end, they're also going after the Government Accountability Board. The reform that was passed in 2007 and it's been in place just 7 years, that's been effective and that's worked well. They want to change it. You know what they want to do? They want to add some partisan elements. And you know what the excuses that they use? They say, well, the Government Accountability Board are 6 retired judges. They're not accountable to anybody. We should have partisans. Maybe legislators should oversee these things because we're accountable, which of course is laughable because of the way they've gerrymandered up the state. There's very few Republicans that are in competitive districts anymore. There's no accountability in our elections because they have safe seats. So it's all a charade. It's all a facade. So that brings us up to yesterday. And I want to close on this, and that is that next month, as you know, there's a Supreme Court election. And Ann Walsh-Bradley is running against a fella from Rock County, a guy by the name of Daly. Is it John Daly? I always forget the first names. Anyway, he's already said that he thinks free speech and the First Amendment are fine. He has no problem with outside groups getting involved in elections. He has no problem with campaign contributions. I don't know how that makes you impartial, but he has no problem with that. He has no problem with groups that are concerned about trying to restrict the voting process, groups that support voter photo ID in Wisconsin. His campaign has no problem with taking support. This is an astonishing statement, as Christine, who's in the audience, could tell you, for a judge, for a sitting judge, to profess support for or be fine with issues that could very well come before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. That's a conflict of interest. And as we've discussed before, 4 of these justices have a tremendous conflict of interest in this John Doe case, obviously with the money that's coming for them. The only judge that's recused herself, by the way, from the John Doe case is Ann Walsh Bradley. And not because she was the recipient of any help from Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce or Wisconsin Club for Growth, just the opposite. They have always and will do everything they can and spend as much as they can to drive her from justice, from her position as Supreme Court Justice. But Ann Walsh Bradley recused herself because she has a relative, her son or somebody, who's with a law firm. And Christine can explain this. I can never get this right. But it's a recusal based on a personal relationship of something that would come before the court. It has with the John Doe. Oh, I know the John Doe. One of the lawyers representing somebody in the John Doe case, I think, is her son. Maybe that's it. Her son's partner. Okay, so it's but she's recusing herself because that's a conflict. Yet these other folks aren't. So, that's kind of what it's up against. And again, my organization, we don't endorse candidates, but we do think it's important that you know where people are on these fundamental issues of democracy, of fair play, and of transparency. And the good news is, if there is any good news, is that it probably, it could get a little worse, actually. It could get a little darker. One of the few things that I've ever liked that John McCain said, at least in recent years, was that it's always darkest before it goes completely black. And we're at the very, very dark stage before it becomes totally black. But we're getting there. The Wisconsin legislature is going to rewrite next month Chapter 11 of the Wisconsin statutes. That's the campaign finance law. And what they want to put in place is the ability not to have to disclose. They want to raise or maybe take contribution limits out altogether. They want to do a whole host of other things, make illegal campaign coordination legal. That's where a lot of the jurisprudence in the country has led in the last few years, obviously at the U.S. Supreme Court level with Citizens United and a whole host of other things. So we have that to go through, and there'll be other things. But when we get to the question, comment, and by the way, these are my ideas. I mean, these aren't ideas; these are facts. But I've laid it out for you. If we knew what to do about the problem, we'd do it, right? We'd get it done. I really want to hear some of the things that you have to say and what you think about this, because that's very helpful to me. It's very helpful to the work we do in Madison. But really what I want to do is just engage with you now and take any questions, comments, condemnations, whatever you have to say, and together maybe we can find some solutions. And by the way, there are some bright spots, I think, ahead for us. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions and comments and whatever else you'd like to do. Throw tomatoes, vegetables, that's fine.
Hello. What recourse is there for for Supreme Court judges, and well, in our state. I mean, for Walker, we at least had the option of a recall. What does the law say? I mean, can they be impeached? What is the law?
I believe, Christine, help me out. I believe Supreme Court justices are subject to recall. I mean, the recall, I think, applies to all statewide candidates. You know, I'm not a big fan of recall. I'll tell you why. Because I think in some ways, although you may feel it's incredibly necessary to do because you're so outraged about it, I think it dissipates the organizing and the energy that you need to put into elections. Because if you spend a lot of time on a recall, that's a tremendous amount of energy to get the petition signed, tremendous amount of energy then to raise the money and do all the work that has to be done. And it's usually in the middle of a term, and then you have to do it again. That dissipates, I think, a lot of the focus and attention. The problem, too, in Wisconsin is that it's just, and this is a very upper Midwestern thing. This is right out of Prairie Home Companion, and maybe you know what I'm talking about. You know, and you've probably come across people like that. They'll say, well, you know, gosh darn it, I don't really like that Scott Walker, but he was elected for 4 years, and he gets to do his 4 years, and then I'll decide. It's that sense of like, you know, that's the rules, and we don't want to step in and do it. I'm just telling you the reality. I think that's one of the primary reasons why he was not recalled in 2012. Even people who hated him just didn't turn out. Now, unfortunately, a lot of those people didn't turn out in 2014 either. But that's another question. That's another problem. We can talk about why that was as well. But you know, the Supreme Court race is incredibly important. There's some reforms we could think about how we could change that. But you know, it's a low turnout election, and if you think about it, your votes are even more important in this election than they'll be in the fall in a presidential race or a gubernatorial race. So the more people you can get to turn out to vote, the bigger voice they'll have in the election. It's really true. It's going to be something like 10%. If we're lucky. So everybody that turns out is going to be able to speak with a louder voice in this election. Yes, sir.
Your report is succinct and enlightening. Why is the public not more informed of this? I mean,
we need more history majors. No. Well, you know, it's a good question. You know, we try to get the word out. We do these things all over the state. I think what often happens is that people who are interested in this anyway will often come to these things. So there's that. But I think part of it is that, you know, there's so many other things that people are feeling pressure about in their daily lives. And, you know, a lot of people just aren't that connected to their politics or their politicians. I think in part it's a problem we haven't even touched on. It was Mandy Wright's big crusade. Well, she had many, but the crusade that I worked with her on, redistricting reform. Legislators are so non-responsive now in so many districts because they don't have to be. Their elections are assured. They don't have to explain any of these things. They don't have to defend themselves. They don't have to compromise. So I think that's part of the problem. You know, I think that we're going to see probably some criminal charges and scandal of some sort. That tends to get the public's attention. That tends to help. It didn't help so much in the caucus scandal, although I would argue it did, because Jim Doyle was in part, he won the Democratic primary, by the way, in 2002, in large part because he ran as the reformer. Tom Barrett and Kathleen Falk, who I know both of them, they're great reformers, but neither of them spoke as loudly about the need to clean up the Capitol as Doyle did. And I think that resonated with a lot of people. And that's why I was so disappointed when he didn't do it. I'll tell you the other thing. And it's key. It's really the most important thing is the leadership. The way you get people concerned about these issues is you get a David Obey, a Mandy Wright. You get somebody who makes this a priority, and a Bob LaFollette, somebody who makes it their message, who says, this is why I'm running for office, this is why I'm going to get elected. Because that's what gets the people, that's what will inform the people. And if you make corruption the central issue and you really run on that, then that becomes the issue that people resonate to. And they make all the connections. They make the connection that unless you clean up the money in politics, you're not going to get quality education or any of the other things that you want. So it's really leadership, as most of life is. Good, solid leaders need to step forward and run on this stuff. Yes, sir. Yeah, sure. Oh, I'm sorry. You want to call them? That's fine. I'm sorry. You choose. Go ahead.
Looking at the bigger picture, is the American Legislative Executive Council dictating policy to the WMC and Club for Growth?
You're talking about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. And for those of you who don't know, it's a national organization, and it's really funded by corporations around the country. And what they do is they fly in legislators, and I'll tell you how they can do it in Wisconsin and not, they can get around we have a rule in Wisconsin that a legislator cannot accept, and Mandy knows this, anything of value. We call it the cup of coffee rule. You can't buy them a meal, you can't give them a trip, you can't do any of that stuff. But the American Legislative Exchange Council in Wisconsin, I think at one time, if not now, recently had the highest number of its legislators. By the way, they're all Republicans except for one Democrat who goes in to spy on them and find out what they're doing. They meet and they present what's called model legislation. And certainly the right to work law, the right to work for less is, I think some people call it, so I think it's probably more appropriate. The right to work law was word for word from the American Legislative Exchange Council. But many of the other things, certain elements of Act 10 were, many of the other sort of taxing bills or other bills are ALEC bills. And the American Legislative Exchange Council, I will tell you, here's a success. There's been great pressure by my national organization, the Center for Media and Democracy, and others to expose who the companies are that fund ALEC. And in the last year alone, the list of corporations that have withdrawn from ALEC, I mean, Google, Facebook, a whole host of corporations, big ones, there's still some big ones involved, have withdrawn support from ALEC because people are catching on that this is sort of a corporate factory for putting out bad legislation. In Wisconsin, the legislators are provided, seriously, they're called scholarships. And you can get a scholarship because under Wisconsin law, you can accept a scholarship. You just can't accept something of value. And the ruling has been that, this is an education thing. So legislators go to, places like New Orleans or Las Vegas. They're always someplace, and they never go, for instance, to Cleveland or, Pittsburgh. It's always some ritzy place. But they are then wined and dined with corporate executives, usually corporate representatives, government affairs people, and they're encouraged to take this model legislation around to their state legislatures. And often, foolishly, they don't change a word. They just have it introduced word for word from ALEC. So, but the good news is that ALEC's influence is waning because of the number of folks that are, and that's because of transparency, by the way. People have found out who the corporations are, and so they're not, there's not as much money backing ALEC and far fewer corporations. So that's a victory. Yes.
Yeah, we went through a move to amend petition drive here. Got the referendum on the ballot, passed by 77%. There's a big movement throughout the state of municipalities that are doing the same thing. What's your opinion of our chances of ever getting a constitutional amendment?
Well, first of all, I support move to amend because obviously, and for those of you who don't know what that is, it's a move to amend the United States Constitution basically to say money is not speech, corporations are not people. It would enable legislatures and the Congress to put spending limits in place. They wouldn't have to be voluntary, they could be mandatory, outlaw corporate contributions, outlaw outside money. So it's a national movement. It's in reaction to the passage, the Citizens United decision. And I think it's an important movement because it educates people all around the state. It gets people motivated. It gives them something to work on. It's an incredibly important part of the movement to take back the government. Having said that, I'm also a realist. It's very difficult to amend the Constitution. And what the movement in Wisconsin is trying to do is to get a resolution that the state legislature would then pass, that would then urge the Congress to support amending the Constitution. So what you're doing is you're trying to urge the legislature to urge the Congress to do something, to amend the Constitution. Having said that, it's the way to do it. It is a way to do it. It's important. But it's also, I think, got to come hand in hand with what's very, very important. And I would argue in some ways, at this point, a little even more important than the move to amend movement, although I know some people that work very hard on that may not appreciate that, and I'm sorry. But really, who is elected the next president of the United States is critically important. And the reason for that is that the United States Supreme Court is 5-4. It's closely divided, 5 who supported the Citizens United decision, 4 who didn't. The next president of the United States will probably have as many as 3, possibly 4 Supreme Court appointments. And there is a decision. It was Justice Stevens, John Paul Stevens' dissenting decision in Citizens United, which will become the majority decision if one of those justices who voted for Citizens United for some reason leaves the court and is replaced by whoever the next president of the United States is and appoints someone who would then be the 5th vote for overturning Citizens United. So that's critical. So both of them are important because without the move to amend process, though, I mean, that's critical for educating citizens about why it's important. And people won't realize why it's important who the next president is until they begin to understand what all this fuss is that people are making in shopping centers about amending the Constitution. That's critically important. So I would say they're both critical. But you probably can't have one without the other. They have to be hand in hand.
I'm kind of baffled at the effectiveness of big money. I see these ads and I look past them, and I'm just wondering, is there ever a time where big money didn't work, and are there some lessons from those elections?
Yeah, it didn't work in Wisconsin for years and years and years, up until about till the late 90s. Yeah, I mean, it has, and we were a different state back then. You know, Walter John Chilson and Dave Obey were friends, even though Obey defeated Walter John Chilson in a special election for Congress in 1969. But they were able to work together when Obey was in Congress, and Schultzen was a Republican state senator from Wausau. So yes, it did work, and it was when money was not polarizing our elections and our politics. Democrats and Republicans used a word that isn't used in Madison. In fact, I don't think it's been uttered in, I don't know, 10 years. It's called compromise. It's not even in the vocabulary anymore. It's just not something anyone uses.
Sir, I'm wondering, has there ever been a big dump of money and it did work?
Oh, occasionally, occasionally there's reaction, in Connecticut, there was a U.S. Senate race, I think it was 4 years ago, where a Republican candidate for office she had been the head of the World Wrestling Federation or something. She outspent her opponent something like 4 or 5 to 1. But even all that money couldn't disguise the fact that she just wasn't up to the job. But I'm not going to. Money usually wins. I mean, it almost always wins. One of the common arguments I hear from people who say we shouldn't have spending limits is the only way you defeat an incumbent is if you can outspend them. Well, in 95% of races for Congress, the incumbent wins because they raise more money. I mean, incumbents, money flows to power, and so usually if you're the incumbent, you're going to attract more money than your opponent. But sometimes it happens. I'll tell you a tragic example of money, which I think is one for Wisconsin, was in 1988 when Wausau's own Tony Earl, he had just been defeated for governor in 1986, and he was running for the United States Senate. And he was the leading candidate. And I don't have any question he would have won had he been elected, had he received the Democratic nomination in 1988. But Herb Kohl, who won the Milwaukee Bucks, came in with $6.5 million right before the primary, a few days before or a few months before the primary, and bought up all the television time, and Tony finished second. Now, Herb was a perfectly good guy. Maybe a lot of you, a lot of us voted for him. That's true. But when I think somebody the quality of Tony Earl as a United States Senator, boy, that would have been something to have him in the United States Senate for a long time. So, money usually has its way, unfortunately. And that's why I think we need spending limits. That's why I think we need public financing. And that's why I think people like you need to start talking about that again, about the need for that. Because Wisconsin and the country worked a lot better when big money wasn't ruling the roost.
I think we should take 2 more questions.
As many as you'd like,
We're
sure.
kind of late, so.
Sure.
You decide who gets to. Jay?
Yes, whoever, yes.
Yeah, it's a very important issue here, and it's very discouraging that people are not convinced. I've been talking to friends, coworkers, and so forth over the years about the importance of money and how it affects our political process and how people are beholden to money. They simply don't buy it.
Yeah.
They don't pay attention to it
Yeah.
unless there's obvious quid pro quo,
Right.
obvious corruption.
Right.
Then they might pay attention. But so how do we educate people? You touched on this a little bit with leadership, but how do we really educate people and make that point to the broad public? I mean, are we going to have to go through an era of extreme corruption before the people see publicly, before people do wake up to this connection? It's not a sexy issue. People don't pay attention to it, and it's not on their radar screen. Although, as we know, it's extremely important. So how do we educate the public here? Really?
Of course, that has been my greatest challenge for the last 19 years at Common Cause. Exactly that question. And I think the way money, I think you're right. People have such a cynical view of politics and of politicians that they say, oh yeah, they're all bought and paid for. They're not particularly surprised, maybe, that they hear that a legislator voted a certain way because of the money that they received. And believe me, people count on that. And again, Mandy, I'm sure could could share some insights. I remember when I worked for a member of Congress, we would occasionally have someone come to us that was a supporter, but would really have a really kind of crappy bill that really maybe wasn't great for consumers. And then we'd sit in the office and we'd say, well, you know, what are the reasons to support this? And, you know, someone would always chirp in, well, there's 10,000 reasons, 5 in the primary election and 5 in the general election, because that was the size of the contribution. That's how it works. It's what we call legalized bribery. So I think if people understood that without that system in place, if they understood, if they could be made to understand how much better their politics and therefore their lives would be, if money wasn't stopping some of the things that they would like to see done or making some of the improvements that they would like to see in their lives, because it's almost always money that stops it. It's almost always you know, campaign contributions, the fear of being attacked from some outside group, you know, Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce, then I think people could be made to understand. I think one of the problems, and that's why I think leadership is so important, I think one of the problems is that people have such a dim view of politics that they don't, I mean, I think everybody kind of likes their own legislator, you know, most people do. Why wouldn't you like Mandy, for instance? You know, I mean, I think most people get that, but they think the institution is corrupt. So in order to transform the institution, you really have to have strong leaders that just pipe this out all the time. And I'm not going to make any endorsements, but, you know, Russ Feingold did something pretty incredible when he was in the Senate. He did what Bob LaFollette used to do. He would what's called read the roll. And he would say, here are the senators that voted against this legislation, and here are the campaign contributions that they received on the floor of the United States Senate. I mean, it takes that kind of grit and chutzpah, if you will, to really break through. So leadership. I mean, I just really think that's it. You know, the newspaper editorial boards are with us on all this stuff. You know, there's not a lot of people that are opposed in general to what we're talking about, but if you had someone that won office, or if you have someone who lost office because their opponent made an issue of the money, that would get attention. And it's going to take some people losing who are on the wrong side of this issue, I think, to capture the attention of the public.
Thank you. How do you turn out the vote at the midterms? I keep seeing this thing that they say, well, they just don't turn out at the midterms because it's not a presidential. The midterms are so important. The last couple of times have been just killers for folks that are interested in progressive issues. And I'm wondering, do we need to have issues like, you know, they always talk about guns, God, and gays? I mean, do we have to have minimum wage or decriminalization of marijuana or something? I can't understand why young people don't turn out, and these midterms, and they just, you know, the people don't vote, and they're just clobbering people with progressive views.
Yes and no. It's an excuse in some ways, but you know, in 2006, that was a midterm election year. And in that year, the Democrats did very well. And one of the reasons why is Doyle was reelected, and so it wasn't a presidential year. One of the reasons why was there was the marriage amendment was on the ballot around Wisconsin. That was the amendment to say that marriage in Wisconsin can only be between a man and a woman. And it passed, as you'll recall, I think it was 59-41. So on the face of it, that looks like it was a tremendous loss. And obviously, it was a loss for that issue. But that turned out college students. The 3 Republicans that represented the Eau Claire assembly seats were ousted. Jeff Smith was elected, and Pat Kreitlow, and so there were a number of folks. And that was an off-year election. So I don't buy the fact that, that you have to have necessarily a presidential race. I'm going to tell you that the answer is it's hard work and it's organizing, because there's no reason why Republicans should turn out more people than Democrats, or progressives should turn out less people than conservatives. There just isn't. And I think, and I'm going to say something else that you may not like, and that is that voter photo ID is coming back. It's going to be in place in Wisconsin. And I've heard a lot of excuses from people saying, well, we'll never be able to win another election if voter photo ID is in place here, because who does that hit disproportionately? It hits minority people, and particularly in Milwaukee, people without driver's licenses, people who rely on public transportation, elderly people, people in rural counties who can't get to a DMV. So those are all factors. But it's going to happen, folks. The Wisconsin voter photo ID is constitutional. It's been declared constitutional by the U.S. Court of Appeals in the Seventh Circuit. There is something going before the United States Supreme Court, but with that present composition of the court, I wouldn't hold your breath about what the outcome there is going to be. The only reason it wasn't in place during the 2012 presidential race, or the 2014 race this last time around, is the U.S. Supreme Court enjoined it from being in place because there wasn't enough time to implement it when the U.S. Court of Appeals put it in place in September of 2014. But it is the law of the state. And I like what General Colin Powell said about this. He is not he was a nominal Republican. He voted for President Obama twice, and he hates voter photo ID. And what he has said, I think, is sound advice, and that is, do it. Get the ID. Find out who doesn't have it. Get it for them. Get them to the DMVs. Get the people that don't have driver's licenses. Get them there. Organize, ride, get them there, and then vote them out of power. That's how you got to do it. There's no easy solutions to these problems. There's no magic bullet. And I think sometimes people on my side are looking for that magic bullet, and it's not. The sad truth is that the conservatives are very well organized, and they had a ground game in 2014, and any of you who are involved in politics, it was far superior than it has been in other years. And that's what you got to do. You got to do the hard work. You got to drag people to the polls in April who haven't voted. You got to give them a cake, whatever it takes. A ride, dinner, a beer, anything. So you got to have a little Chicago in you. You got a little. Let's say that.
Thank you, Jay. You're really making us all really optimistic.
Nowhere to go but up. But thank you very much. You were a great audience and receptive, and I hope I haven't depressed you too much. But I think politics, as anybody who's been involved in it, is cyclical. The pendulum does indeed swing back and forth. So don't lose heart. Just get mad and get even. But thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.